Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final lecture. In not only in chapter 6, but also in the unit on the legislative branch. And in this one, it's a pretty short one. We're just going to take a look at Congress and the president and how they interact with each other, or how they've interacted with each other through the years. So let's get started. So, depending on the president, depending on the time period, depending on Congress, who's in control, what in terms of what political parties in control across both, um, and then the type of in terms of how they act. We've either had a cooperative relationship between the president and Congress, or we've had a conflicting relationship between the two. Generally, you want them to be cooperative all the time because then more things are gonna get done. But that's not always the case. Now, typically, when you have a president that is less active, one that does not really step out and seek their own program and lets the legislative branch really do what they are designed to do, typically you're going to have a better relationship between Congress and the president because Congress is able to do what they want to do and they don't have a president that's stepping on their toes or somebody they view that is doing so. Now, generally, the more active a president you have, generally the more the relationship that they're going to have is going to be worse. Now, typically, this is because Congress is going to feel like they're getting restricted by the president. The president stepping on their toes or just getting in the way. Now, that's not always the case. It just means that, in general, that typically is what happens. Now, other things, it says constituents and conflict. Now, this is where what this means is the president has their job is ultimately different than what Congress's job is different because you have to look at who they're supposed to represent. The president is supposed to represent the entire country. Congress, if you're looking at it from the House of Representatives standpoint, they're representing their own districts. And then at the Senate level, they're representing their own states. So already there you do have a little bit of conflict, or where it can actually happen or take place. And then checks and balances can actually lead to better cooperation or conflict depending on what's going on, because it gives them a chance to counteract each other if need be. Okay, now, furthermore, co-op and conflict, party politics. This is probably the biggest issue that we have in our country right now at every single level, regardless if we're talking about Congress here or the president, or we're talking about our governor here in Michigan with the state legislative branch, because people have been increasingly just going partisan and voting for one party or only staying along the lines of their position. They're not willing to compromise. And this can cause problems more so now, and it has, by slowing things down or making things, having compromises when they do take place that are so convoluted that you actually end up losing a lot of things that were necessarily in terms of what the people wanted to have done, whether it's the president trying to get that passed or whether it's the legislative branch trying to do so. So it can cause a lot of issues, and hopefully this will change in the years to come. But unfortunately, we've seen an increasing level of party politics, specifically here under the division under President Trump and the Democrats in Congress. They have not gotten along very well. And then organizational wise, this can lead to more either cooperation or conflict. The rules that are set in place, such as unlimited debates in our legislative branch, can slow things down. The committee system can actually lead to better implementation of what the president wants, specifically if they have control, or it can lead to stalling the implementation of the agenda that the president wants. And then the other part is just the timetable. You have to look at it in terms of this. The president only really has 3+ years, to 8 years, if they're lucky, to move their programs and get them in. And that's it. They can't be reelected after the second term. Where Congress, yes, they're operating either on a shorter or longer term, depending on if you're a senator or representative. But you have to remember, there's no limits to reelection, and about 90% of all representatives and senators get reelected. So even though their term could end, typically they're going to be reelected over and over and over again, so they have time. So specifically when you have a conflicting legislative branch with the president, they can wait them out generally because they're like, well, I can just get reelected, and that's what you saw. And you see this more when the president is in his second term, or towards the end of his second term. But that's an example of this would be when Anthony Scalia died, and opened a Supreme Court position up. Obama wanted to appoint somebody, and he had almost a year until his second term was over. But Congress was controlled, specifically the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, and they just sat on it. They said, we're not even going to interview who you want to put forward, because they were trying to play a waiting game to see if they could win, their presidential candidate could win the 2016 election. Now they were lucky in that their candidate Trump won the election, so the gamble paid off. But that could have really hurt them in the long run if they wouldn't have been successful, because then they were opening themselves up from attack by the people, because you left a Supreme Court, you would have left a Supreme Court position open for more than a year, easily. Okay, now this struggle for power, and this is also part of the area where conflict has come about, and this has been a big story throughout really every president that's been an active president, not just in recent times, but even back in the 1800s, it was a big issue. So in about the first 150 years or so of our country, Congress was the dominating policy-making body, or dominant policy-making body in our government, even though there was a struggle for power at certain times in the 1800s. Checks and balances were creating competition among the branches. There was gridlock that was going on. But then what changed is FDR came into office. And he started to change not only the presidency, but how he worked with the legislative branch. Specifically, he wanted to expand the number of positions in the Supreme Court. And then also you have to look at all the policies he was trying to enact under his New Deal. And this kind of changed this struggle for power and ramped it up. And it led to certain instances where Congress and the president would actually come in conflict, specifically, as you see on the screen, over emergency powers. Because generally, in times of emergency, the president gets more powers than they normally would get. Again, this is where we look back to that exception to the rule. Think of the American Civil War. Why do you think President Lincoln was never really, or has not really been criticized now for him suspending the writ of habeas corpus? Because it was the Civil War. People give him a free pass. And again, this was looked at, if you go back and look at presidents in terms of they acted specifically during times of war. People may hate it at that moment, but they generally, in the look back, if something's successful, specifically like World War II or something, they look back at it and say, okay, we're going to give them a pass on that because of the situation. And we're kind of seeing that right now, for better or worse, and it'll remain to be seen because we're living through it with President Trump's actions going through with this coronavirus pandemic, and we're gonna see how this is gonna work out in the weeks and months that follow. One example that was passed to actually curb these powers was the National Emergencies Act, where the president has to notify Congress when they declare a national emergency, and they can only limit it to 1 year in length without congressional consent to extend it if need be. And again, this is just to say, hey, look, make sure that you're telling us what's going on. Don't just enact what you want to do. It's kind of another example of checks and balances. All right, I think we got 2 slides left. So we have other examples of struggle for power is over the budget. One of the president's biggest jobs they have to do every single year is they have to plan the national budget. Well, who do they plan that with? They plan it with Congress. So this Budget Impoundment and Control Act actually increased the role Congress had in planning that budget, leading to the Congressional Budget Office and making sure that that funding, or what the budget is going to be laid out as, is going to not only work for what the president wants to do, but what Congress wants to do. And again, as you guys can see, this would work much better, and does, when the president and Congress are along the same political lines, whether it's Republican or Democrat. Okay? And what Congress can do is they can actually impound funds. They can impound funds, and in terms of where the money's going to go. Okay? Now, any funding that is sent somewhere has to be spent, unless Congress sides with the president to say, look, we don't need to spend that funding, and we can send it somewhere else. All right. Last slide here, real quick one, is we have the legislative veto. It has been ruled unconstitutional if something is a violation of separation of powers, but this was used as a challenge to the president's authority. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't do it. It just means that there have been instances in the past where they say, look, it is unconstitutional. They can use what we call legislative override. So it's not a veto, but it's an override of an action. Okay, and then the last thing here is what we call a line item veto. Now this is where the president can actually, if a bill is sent to the desk of the president, and you can see this is a political cartoon is really criticizing George W. Bush in the years after September 11th, with the Patriot Act, where he was just crossing things out willy-nilly in terms of what he wanted, in terms of what this person who drew this cartoon is saying. But this, you can see the example of what a line item veto would be, is you would literally just go, and the president would look at it and say, all right, let's look at this, and say, okay, we don't want this. Or, I like this, but this part needs to go. Now, true line item power really isn't necessarily within the legislative branch and in the executive branch. It really lies at the state level with governors, where an amendment is needed to be given to the president if this takes place. Realistically, guys, for this course, all you really need to know is about a line item veto is just know what it means. You don't have to really apply it for too much, because it doesn't come up very often. All right, guys, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this unit on the legislative branch. Up next, we're gonna do the exact same kind of set, where we're gonna cover 2 chapters again. Together, we're gonna move on to the executive branch, and you'll hear a lot of similar things that we talked about in here in terms of how the executive branch works with the legislative branch, but also in terms of their powers, which we kind of went over a little bit in our unit on the Constitution earlier in this course. All right, guys, have a great day.